It's part 3 of the Legends of Smooth Jazz tonight on Saturday, January 21st, 2023. I'm your host, Jason DiCanio. Miles Davis is our look once again, and as we continue on his great legacy, we're going to hopefully wrap up all of this tonight on part 3 of the Legends of Smooth Jazz right now, right here. Okay, good evening to all of you, and welcome to this edition of the Legends of Smooth Jazz. I'm your host, Jason DiCanio, for Saturday, January 21st, 2023. This is episode 3. Hope you had a great week as we are getting ready to wind up Miles Davis's legacy right here. This is part 3 of his great history. But we got a lot to cover, and we got a lot to do in a short amount of time, so let's get to it. 1963 to 68, and we'll look at his second quintet right now, picking up where we left off from the Wikipedia. It's December 1962, and Davis, Kelly, Chambers, Cobb, and Rollins played together for the last time, as the first 3 wanted to leave and play as a trio. Rollins left them soon after, leaving Davis to pay over $25,000, which is the equivalent of $224,000 in 2021, to cancel upcoming gigs and quickly assemble a new group. Following auditions, he found his new band in tenor saxophonist George Coleman, bassist Ron Carter, pianist Victor Feldman, and drummer Frank Butler. But May of 1963, Feldman and Butler were replaced by 23-year-old pianist Herbie Hancock and 17-year-old drummer Tony Williams, who made Davis excited all over again. With this group, Davis completed the rest of what became Seven Steps to Heaven in 63 and recorded the live albums Miles Davis in Europe in 64, My Funny Valentine in 65, and Four and More in 66. The quintet played essentially the same bebop tunes and standards that Davis's previous bands had played, but they approached them with structural and rhythmic freedom and occasionally breakneck speed. 1964, Coleman was briefly replaced by saxophonist Sam Rivers, who recorded with Davis on Miles in Tokyo until Wayne Shorter was persuaded to leave Art Blakey. The quintet with Shorter lasted through 1968, with the saxophonist becoming the group's principal composer. The album ESP in 65 was renamed after his composition. And while touring Europe, the group made its first album, Miles in Berlin, in 65. Davis needed medical attention for hip pain, which had worsened since his Japanese tour during the previous year. He underwent hip replacement surgery in April of 1965 with bone taken from his shin, but it failed. After his 3rd month in the hospital, he discharged himself due to boredom and went home. He returned to the hospital in August after a fall required the insertion of a plastic hip joint. In November of 1965, he had recovered enough to return to performing with his quintet, which included gigs at the Plugged Nickel in Chicago. Tio Macero returned as his record producer after their rift over Quiet Nights had healed. In January of 66, Davis spent 3 months in the hospital with a liver infection. When he resumed touring, he performed more at colleges because he had grown tired of the typical jazz venues. Columbia president Clive Davis reported in 66 his sales had declined to around 40 to 50,000 per album, compared to as many as 100,000 per release a few years before. Matters were not helped by the press reporting his apparent financial troubles and imminent demise. After his appearance at the 1966 Newport Jazz Festival, he returned to the studio with his quintet for a series of sessions. He started a relationship with actress Cicely Tyson, who helped him reduce his alcohol consumption. Material from the 66 to 68 sessions was released on Miles Smiles in 66, Sorcerer in 67, Nefertiti in 67, Miles in the Sky in 68, and Feliz de Kilimanjaro in 68. The quintet's approach to the new music became known as Time No Changes, which referred to Davis's decision to depart from chordal sequences and adopt a more open approach, with the rhythm section responding to the soloist's melodies. Through Nefertiti, the studio recordings consisted primarily of originals composed by Shorter, with an occasional compositions by the other sidemen. In 1967, the group began to play their concerts in continuous sets, each tune flowing into the next, with only the melody indicating any sort of change. His bands performed this way until his hiatus in 1975. Miles in the Sky and Feliz de Kilimanjaro, which tentatively introduced electric bass, electric piano, and electric guitar on some tracks, pointed the way to the fusion phase of Davis's career. He also began experimenting with more rock-oriented rhythms on these records. And by the time the second half of Feliz de Kilimanjaro was recorded, bassist David Holland and pianist Chick Corea had replaced Carter and Hancock. Davis soon took over the compositional duties of his sidemen. In a Silent Way was recorded in a single studio session in February of 1969 with Shorter, Hancock, Holland, and Williams alongside keyboardist Chick Corea and Joseph Zwinall and guitarist John McLaughlin. The album contains two long tracks that Massaro pieced together from different takes recorded at the session. And when the album was released later that year, some critics accused him of selling out to the rock and roll audience. Nevertheless, it reached number 134 on the U.S. Billboard Top LPs chart, his first album since My Funny Valentine to reach the chart. In a Silent Way was his entry into jazz fusion. The touring band of the 69-70 with Shorter, Corea, Holland, and DeJohnette never completed a studio together and became known as Davis's Lost Quintet, though radio broadcasts from the band's European tour have been extensively bootlegged. For the double album Bitches Brew in 70, he hired Jack DeJohnette, Arito Moriarty, and Benny Maupin. The album contained long compositions, some over 20 minutes, that were never played in the studio but were constructed from several takes by Massaro and Davis via splicing and tape loops amid epical advances in multi-track recording technologies. Bitches Brew peaked at number 35 on the Billboard album chart, and in 1976 it was certified gold for selling over 500,000 records. By 2003, it sold over 1 million copies. March of 70, Davis began to perform as the opening act for rock bands, allowing Columbia to market Bitches Brew to a larger audience. He shared a Fillmore East bill with the Steve Miller Band and Neil Young with Crazy Horse on March 6th and 7th. Biographer Paul Tingen wrote, Miles' newcomer status in the environment led to mixed audience reactions, often having to play for dramatically reduced fees and enduring the sellout accusations from the jazz world, as well as being attacked by sections of the black press for supposedly genuflecting to white culture. The 1970 tours included the 1970 Isle of Wight Festival on August 29th, when he performed to an estimated 600,000 people, the largest of his career. Plans to record with Hendrix ended after the guitarist's death. His funeral was the last one that Davis attended. Several live albums with a transitional sextet septet included Corea, DeJohnette, Holland, Moraria, saxophonist Steve Grossman, and keyboardist Keith Jarrett were recorded during this period. including Miles Davis at Fillmore in 1970 and Black Beauty, Miles Davis at Fillmore West in 73. By 1971, Davis had signed a contract with Columbia that paid him $100,000 a year, the equivalent to $669,100 in 2021, for 3 years in addition to royalties. He recorded a soundtrack album, Jack Johnson, for this 1970 documentary film about heavyweight boxer Jack Johnson, containing 2 long pieces of 25 and 26 minutes in length with Hancock, McLaughlin, Sonny Sharrock, and Billy Cobham. He was committed to making music for African Americans who liked more commercial, pop, groove-oriented music. And by November of 1971, DeJohnette and Moriara had been replaced in the touring ensemble by drummer Leon Ngudu Chancellor and percussionist James Mutme and Don Alias. Live Evil was released in the same month, showcasing bassist Michael Henderson, who had replaced Holland in 1970. The album demonstrated that Davis's ensemble had transformed into a funk-oriented group while retaining the exploratory imperative of Bitches Brew. In 1972, composer-arranger Paul Buckmaster introduced Davis to the music of avant-garde composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, leading to a period of creative exploration. Biographer J.K. Chambers wrote, "The effect of Davis's study of Stockhausen could not be repressed for long. Davis's own space music shows Stockhausen's influence compositionally." His recordings and performances during this period were described as space music by fans. Feather and Buckmaster, who described it as a lot of mood changes, heavy, dark, intense, definitely space music. The studio album On the Corner in 1972 blended the influence of Stockhausen and Buckmaster with funk elements. Davis invited Buckmaster to New York City to oversee the writing and recording of the album with Massaro. The album reached number 1 on the Billboard Jazz Chart, but peaked at number 156 on the most heterogeneous Top 200 Albums chart. Davis felt that Columbia marketed it to the wrong audience. The music was meant to be heard by young black people, but they just treated it like any other jazz album and advertised it that way, pushed it on the jazz radio stations. Young black kids don't listen to those stations. They listen to R&B stations and some rock stations. In October of 1972, he broke his ankles in a car crash. He took painkillers and cocaine to cope with the pain. Looking back at his career after the incident, he wrote, "Everything started to blur." After recording On the Corner, he assembled a group with Henderson Mutame, Carlos Garnett, guitarist Reggie Lucas, organist Lonnie Liston Smith, tabla player Badal Roy, sitarist Khalil Balakrishna, and drummer Al Foster. Only Smith was a jazz instrumentalist. Consequently, the music emphasized rhythmic density and shifting textures instead of solos. This group was recorded live in 1972 for In Concert, but Davis found it unsatisfactory, leading him to drop the tabla and sitar and play keyboards. He also added guitarist Pete Kosey. The compilation studio album Big Fun contains 4 long improvisations recorded between 1969 and 1972. Studio sessions throughout 73 and 74 led to Get Up With It, an album which included 4 long pieces alongside 4 shorter recordings from 1970 and 1972. The track He Loved Him Madly, a 30-minute tribute to the recently deceased Duke Ellington, influenced Brian Eno's ambient music. In the United States, it performed comparably to On the Corner, reaching number 8 on the jazz chart and number 141 on the pop chart. He then concentrated on live performance with a series of concerts that Columbia released on the double live albums Agharda in 75, Pangea in 76, and Dark Magus in 77. The first 2 are recordings of 2 sets from February 1st, 1975 in Osaka, by which time Davis was troubled by several physical ailments. He relied on alcohol, codeine, and morphine to get through the engagements. His shows were routinely panned by critics who mentioned his habit of performing with his back to the audience. Kosei later asserted that the band really advanced after the Japanese tour, but Davis was again hospitalized for his ulcers and a hernia during a tour of the U.S. while opening for Herbie Hancock. After appearances at the 1975 Newport Jazz Festival in July and the Schaefer Music Festival in New York in September, Davis dropped out of music. In his autobiography, Davis wrote frankly about his life during his hiatus from music. He called his Upper West Side brownstone a wreck and chronicled his heavy use of alcohol and cocaine, in addition to sexual encounters with many women. He also stated that sex and drugs took the place music had occupied in my life. Drummer Tony Williams recalled that by noon, on average, Davis would be sick from the previous night's intake. In December of 1975, he had regained enough strength to undergo a much-needed hip replacement operation. In December of 76, Columbia was reluctant to renew his contract and pay his usual large advances. But after his lawyer started negotiating with United Artists, Columbia matched their offer, establishing the Miles Davis Fund to pay him regularly. Pianist Vladimir Horowitz was the only other musician with Columbia who had a similar status. In 1978, Davis asked fusion guitarist Larry Coryell to participate in sessions with keyboardist Masakombe Kikuchi and George Pavlis, bassist T.M. Stevens, and drummer Al Foster. Davis played the arranged piece up-tempo, abandoned his trumpet for the organ, and had Massaro recorded the session without the band's knowledge. After Coryell declined a spot in a band that Davis was beginning to put together, Davis returned to his reclusive lifestyle in New York City. Soon after, Marguerite Eskridge had Davis jailed for failing to pay child support for their son Aaron, which cost him $10,000, or the equivalent to $41,550 in 2021, for release on bail. A recording session that involved Buckmaster and Gil Evans was halted, with Evans leaving after failing to receive the payment he was promised. In August of 1978, Davis hired a new manager, Mark Rothbaum, who had worked with him since 1972. And having played the trumpet little throughout the previous 3 years, Davis found it difficult to reclaim his embouchure. His first post-hiatus studio appearance took place in May of 1980. A day later, Davis was hospitalized due to a leg infection. He recorded The Man with the Horn from June 1980 to May of 1981, with Massaro producing. A large band was abandoned in favor of a combo with saxophonist Bill Evans and bassist Marcus Miller. Both would collaborate with him during the next decade. The Man with the Horn received a poor critical reception, despite selling well. In June of 1981, Davis returned to the stage for the first time since 1975 in a 10-minute guest solo as part of Mel Lewis's band at the Village Vanguard. This was followed by appearances with a new band, and recordings from a mixture of dates from 1981, including from the Kicks in Boston and Avery Fisher Hall, were released on We Want Miles, which earned him a Grammy Award for Best Jazz Instrumental Performance by a Soloist. Now, in January of '82, while Tyson was working in Africa, Davis went a little wild with alcohol and suffered a stroke that temporarily paralyzed his right hand. Tyson returned home and cared for him. After 3 months of treatment with a Chinese acupuncturist, he was able to play the trumpet again. He listened to his doctor's warnings and gave up alcohol and drugs. He credited Tyson with helping his recovery, which involved exercise, piano playing, and visits to spas. She encouraged him to draw, which he pursued for the rest of his life. Davis resumed touring in May of 1982 with a lineup that included percussionist Mino Sinuel, or Sinlu, guitarist John Schofield, with whom he worked closely on the album Star People in 1983. Now, mid-1983, he worked on the tracks for Decoy, an album mixing soul music and electronica that was released in 1984. He brought in producer, composer, and keyboardist Robert Irving III, who had collaborated with him on The Man with the Horn. With a 7-piece band that included Schofield, Evans, Irving, Foster, and Darryl Jones, he played a series of European performances that were positively received. In December of 1984, while in Denmark, he was awarded the Leon Sunning Music Prize. Trumpeter Palle Mikkelberg had written Aura, a contemporary classical piece, for the event, which impressed Davis to the point of returning to Denmark in early of 1985 to record his next studio album, Aura. Columbia was dissatisfied with the recording and, of course, delayed its release. Then in May of 1985, 1 month into a tour, Davis signed a contract with Warner Brothers that required him to give up his publishing rights. You're Under Arrest, his final album for Columbia, was released in September. It included cover versions of 2 pop songs, Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper and Michael Jackson's Human Nature. He considered releasing an album of pop songs, and he recorded dozens of them, but the idea was rejected. He said that many of today's jazz standards had been pop songs in Broadway theater, and that he was simply updating the standards repertoire. Davis collaborated with a number of figures from the British post-punk and new wave movements during this period, including Scritti Politti. This period also saw Davis move from his funk-inspired sound of the early 70s to a more melodic style. After taking part in the recording of the 85 protest song Sun City as a member of Artists United Against Apartheid, Davis appeared on the instrumental Don't Stop Me Now by Toto for their album Fahrenheit in '86. He collaborated with Prince on a song titled Can I Play With You, which went unreleased until 2020. Davis also collaborated with Zane Giles and Randy Hall on the Rubber Band sessions in '85, but those would remain unreleased until 2019. Instead, he worked with Marcus Miller and Tutu in '86, and it became the first time he used modern studio tools such as programmed synthesizers, sampling, and drum loops. Released in September of '86, its front cover is a photographic portrait of Davis by Irving Penn. In 1987, he won a Grammy Award for Best Jazz Instrumental Performance Soloist. Also in 1987, Davis contacted American journalist Quincy Troop to work with him on his autobiography. The 2 men had met the previous year when Troop conducted a 2-day-long interview, which was published by Spin as a 45-page article. And then in 1988, Davis had a small part as a street musician in the Christmas comedy film Scrooged, starring Bill Murray. He also collaborated with Zucchero Fornaciari in a version of Dune Mosse, or The Blues, published in 2004 in Zoo & Company, of the Italian bluesman. In November of '88, he was inducted into the Knights of Malta at a ceremony at the Alhambra Palace in Spain, and this was part of the reasoning for his daughter's decision to include the honorific Sir on his headstone. Later that month, Davis cut his European tour short after he collapsed and fainted after a 2-hour show in Madrid and flew home. There were rumors of more poor health reported by the American magazine Star in its February 21st, 1989 edition, which published a claim that Davis had contracted AIDS, prompting his manager, Pete Schukat, to issue a statement the following day. Schukat said Davis had been in the hospital for a mild case of pneumonia and the removal of a benign polyp on his vocal cords, and was resting comfortably in preparation for his 1989 tours. Davis later blamed one of his former wives or girlfriends for starting the rumor and decided against taking legal action. He was interviewed on 60 Minutes by Harry Reasoner in October of 1989. He received a Grand Médaille de Vermeil from Paris Mayor Jacques Chirac. In 1990, he received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. In early 1991, he appeared in the Rolf de Heer film Dingo as a jazz musician. He followed Tutu with Amandala in 1989, and soundtracks to 4 films: Street Smart, Siesta, The Hotspot, and Dingo. His last albums were released posthumously. The hip-hop influenced Doo-Bop, 1992, and Miles and Quincy Live at Mantra, 1993, a collaboration with Quincy Jones from the 1991 Mantra Jazz Festival, where for the first time in 3 decades, he performed songs from Miles Ahead, Porgy and Bess, and Sketches of Spain. July 1991, July 8th, Davis returned to performing material from his past at the 1991 Montreux Jazz Festival with a band and orchestra conducted by Quincy Jones. The set consisted of arrangements from his albums recorded with Gil Evans. The show was followed by a concert billed as Miles and Friends at the Grand Hall de la Villette in Paris 2 days later, with guest performances by musicians from throughout his career, including John McLaughlin, Herbie Hancock, and Joe Zawinul. In Paris, he was awarded a knighthood, the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, by French culture minister Jacques Lang, who called him the Picasso of jazz. After returning to America, he stopped in New York City to record material for Doo-Bop, and then returned to California to play at the Hollywood Bowl on August 25th, his final live performance. Well, in early September 1991, Davis checked into St. John's Hospital near his home in Santa Monica, California for a routine test. Doctors suggested he have a tracheal tube implanted to relieve his breathing after repeated bouts of bronchial pneumonia. The suggestion provoked an outburst from Davis that led to an intracerebral hemorrhage, followed by a coma. And according to Joe Gelbard, on September 26th, Davis painted his final painting, composed of dark, ghostly figures, dripping blood, and his imminent demise. After several days on life support, his machine was turned off, and he died on September 28th, 1991, in the arms of Gelbard. He was 65 years old. His death was attributed to the combined efforts of a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure. And according to Troop, Davis was taking azithromycin, a type of antiretroviral drug used for the treatment of HIV and AIDS during his treatments in the hospital. A funeral service was held on October 5th, 1991, at St. Peter's Lutheran Church on Lexington Avenue in New York City, that was attended by around 500 friends, family members, and musical acquaintances, with many fans standing in the rain. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York City, with one of his trumpets near the site of Duke Ellington's grave. At the time of his death, Davis's estate was valued at more than $1 million, equivalent to roughly $2 million in 2021. In his will, Davis left 20% to his daughter Cheryl Davis, 40% to his son Aaron Davis, 10% to his nephew Vincent Wilbur Jr., and 15% to each brother Vernon Davis and his sister Dorothy Wilburn. He excluded his 2 sons Gregory and Miles IV. Well, his legacy and influence is considered one of the most innovative, influential, and respected figures in the history of music. Based on professional rankings of his albums and songs, the aggregate website Acclaimed Music lists him as the 16th most acclaimed recording artist in history. The Guardian described him as a pioneer of 20th century music, leading many of the key developments of the world of jazz. He has been called one of the great inventors in jazz, and had the titles Prince of Darkness and the Picasso of Jazz bestowed upon him. The Rolling Stone Encyclopedia of Rock and Roll said, Miles Davis played a crucial and inevitably controversial role in every major development in jazz since the mid-40s, and no other jazz musician has had so profound an effect on rock. Miles Davis was the most widely recognized jazz musician of his era, an outspoken social critic, and an arbiter of style in attitude and fashion, as well as music. And there you have it. Miles Davis, in his legacy, 3 parts. We looked at a man who did it all from 1944 to 1991, spanning almost 50 years. Thank you for joining me here on the Legends of Smooth Jazz. Next week, we will look at another great legend, one of the great drummers of all time. You know who I'm talking about. That's right. We're going to look at Buddy Rich. That's right. The man with the drums. He was the American jazz drummer and band leader, songwriter, conductor, and he's one of the most influential drummers of all time. Born September 30th, 1917, died April 2nd, 1987. We'll look at him next week as our Legends of Smooth Jazz continues on YouTube. Thank you for your support. We will see you next week. Have a great week from now on, we'll see you then. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to the David3000 Network for great more content like this one.